The first thing Evan Cross did after signing the divorce papers was laugh. Not a loud laugh, just a quiet, confident smirk. The kind a man wears when he believes he has finally won. The kind that says, "I made the right call." Across the polished conference table, Clara Ashford sat perfectly still. Her hands rested on her lap. No trembling. No tears. No last-minute pleas. She had already signed her name where the sticky note pointed, her pen strokes calm and deliberate. Evan leaned back in his chair and adjusted his Mont Blanc pen like a trophy. "You know," he said casually, glancing at the papers, "most people would have fought harder. But I guess this is easier when you don't have much to lose." Clara didn't respond. The lawyer cleared his throat, eyes darting between them. Evan waved him off, still amused. "It's fine. We're done here. On clean break. No assets. No drama." He paused, then added with a soft chuckle, "Honestly, Clara, I'm doing you a favor. You wouldn't survive my world anyway." Clara nodded once. That nod was all Evan needed to confirm every assumption he'd made about her over the past 7 years. That she was quiet because she was weak, simple because she was insignificant, replaceable because she had nothing of value. He stood, already checking his iPhone, as if the marriage had been nothing more than a meeting that ran a little long. "Send me the final copy," he told the lawyer. "And don't worry, she understands." He didn't see Clara's fingers tighten for half a second. He didn't notice the lawyer hesitate before closing the folder. And he definitely didn't know that the document he'd just signed, without reading the fine print, was the last barrier protecting him from a truth so heavy it would eventually crush everything he thought he owned. Because Clara Ashford didn't walk out of that room as a discarded ex-wife. She walked out as a woman who had just fulfilled the final condition of a sealed trust, one designed to test not her wealth, but her character. And the moment the elevator doors closed behind her, a phone across town lit up with a single message. She signed. Activate the Ashford Continuum. Evan Cross had just divorced the woman who legally controlled the future of his entire world, and he wouldn't realize it until it was far too late. Clara learned early in the marriage that love, with Evan, was never free. It was measured, tallied, quietly converted into a debt she was always expected to repay. At first it came disguised as concern. Evan would sigh after long days at work, loosening his tie in their Manhattan apartment, while Clara reheated leftovers. "You don't know how lucky you are," he'd say casually. "Most women would kill to live like this." He never said with me. He said like this: the view, the address, the lifestyle he believed he alone provided. Clara would nod, guilt forming where gratitude should have been. When she turned down a full-time job offer to keep freelancing, Evan didn't argue. He smiled. Then, weeks later, he mentioned it at a dinner party. "Clara prefers simple work," he joked, glass of wine in hand. "No pressure. Not everyone's built for ambition." Laughter followed. Clara smiled too, even as something small inside her folded in on itself. From then on, every kindness came with an invisible price tag. If Evan paid for dinner, he expected silence when he came home late. If he covered rent, he expected admiration. If he stayed married, Clara was expected to be endlessly understanding. When she asked why he'd stopped inviting her to events, he didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned back and said, "You wouldn't be comfortable there. And honestly, I can't afford distractions right now." She wondered when she had become a distraction. Money conversations were always framed as generosity. Evan transferred an allowance into their joint account and reminded her, gently, often, that budgeting mattered. When Clara bought a second-hand coat instead of replacing her cracked phone, he praised her for knowing her place. Love, in this marriage, was not something Clara received. It was something she earned by taking up less space. Still, she believed in effort, in patience, in the quiet math of sacrifice eventually balancing out. What she didn't realize was that Evan had already rewritten the equation. To him, Clara wasn't a partner. She was an expense that no longer justified itself. And when a man starts seeing love as a liability, he doesn't ask how to fix it. He starts looking for a refund. And Evan Cross had already decided he was done paying. The change didn't happen all at once. That was the most dangerous part. Clara didn't wake up one morning erased from her own life. She faded, slowly, the way a name disappears from a chalkboard after too many careless wipes. It started with decisions. Evan stopped asking what she thought, about travel plans, about investments, about weekends. He'd inform her instead, usually while scrolling through emails on his iPad, his tone efficient and final. "I'll be in Boston this weekend," or "I moved some money around. Nothing you need to worry about." At first, Clara told herself it was normal. Evan was busy, important. His work demanded focus. So she adapted. She learned to phrase opinions like questions, then learned not to ask them at all. Then came the introductions. At networking events, Evan no longer said, "This is my wife, Clara." He said, "Clara handles some freelance stuff." Sometimes he didn't introduce her at all. She became the woman holding his coat, the quiet presence hovering just outside conversations about deals and growth. One night, standing in a sleek midtown bar, Clara realized no one had spoken directly to her in over an hour. Not because they were rude, because Evan had already decided she didn't belong in the frame. At home, her world shrank further. Evan moved his work calls into the bedroom and shut the door. His laughter, once shared, became something she overheard. When Clara mentioned feeling lonely, Evan sighed, as if she'd asked for something unreasonable. "You're overthinking," he said. "We're fine. You just need more hobbies." She wondered when loneliness had become a personal flaw. Her belongings began to disappear from shared spaces, photos replaced by framed awards, her books boxed away to make room for his. Even her coffee mug, the chipped one she loved, vanished one morning, replaced by a matching set she didn't remember choosing. Clara noticed. She always noticed. But she told herself that love meant adjusting, that marriage required compromise. That being easy to live with was a kind of strength. What she didn't see was that Evan wasn't asking her to adjust. He was making room for a future that didn't include her. By the time Clara understood that she had been quietly written out of her own marriage, Evan had already moved on emotionally. And the scariest part? He truly believed she wouldn't notice, because people rarely fear losing what they've already stopped seeing. Clara didn't go looking for proof. That was the part Evan never understood. She wasn't suspicious by nature. She still believed, even then, that if something was wrong, it would announce itself loudly. She believed truth demanded to be seen. Instead, it slipped in quietly. It happened on a Tuesday night, ordinary in every way. Evan had fallen asleep on the couch, suit jacket tossed over the armrest, and a phone buzzing softly beside him. Clara stood in the kitchen rinsing a mug when the sound repeated, short, insistent, intimate. Not a work notification, a message. She told herself to ignore it, but the screen lit up again, and this time the name was visible. Lena. No last name. No emoji. Just one word, glowing against the dark like it had been there longer than Clara realized. Clara's chest tightened, not with panic, but with a strange sense of recognition, as if a missing puzzle piece had finally surfaced. Not dramatic, not explosive, just clarifying. She didn't unlock the phone. She didn't read the message. She didn't need to. Because Evan stirred, half awake, and his hand moved instinctively. Not toward her, but toward the phone. He turned it face down before his eyes even opened. That movement told her everything. Later that night, Evan showered longer than usual. He hummed under his breath, a sound Clara hadn't heard in months. When he came out, his mood was lighter, careless even. He kissed her cheek distractedly and said, "Big day tomorrow. Don't wait up." Clara lay awake long after the apartment went quiet. She replayed moments she had dismissed, sudden smiles at unread texts, business trips added last minute, his irritation when she asked simple questions. None of it screamed betrayal. It whispered it, and whispers are harder to argue with. Over the next few weeks, the name appeared again and again, not directly, but in absences. In Evan's focus, drifting. In the way he guarded his phone like it contained something fragile. Clara never confronted him. She understood something then, something subtle and devastating. If she asked, Evan would deny. If she accused, he would blame her insecurity. And if she cried, he would call it manipulation. So she did the one thing he didn't expect. She paid attention. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't need to be dragged into the light. Sometimes, it waits patiently until you're strong enough to survive it. And Clara was just beginning to wake up. The first time Evan humiliated Clara in public, he did it with a smile. It happened at a rooftop networking mixer overlooking the Manhattan skyline, the kind of event where conversations were currency and appearances mattered more than truth. Clara hadn't planned to attend. Evan insisted at the last minute. "It'll be good for you," he said, already distracted. "Just don't overthink it." She wore a simple black dress, nothing flashy, nothing wrong. At first, Evan stayed close, on his hand resting lightly on her back, like a prop he hadn't decided whether to keep. But as the night unfolded, he drifted, toward louder laughs, firmer handshakes, people who mattered more. Clara found herself standing alone near the edge of the terrace, watching city lights blink like distant signals she couldn't reach. Then Evan called her over. "Hey," he said, arms slung casually around her shoulders as a small group gathered. "This is Clara." That was it. No last name. No context. A man beside him smiled politely. "And what do you do, Clara?" Before she could answer, Evan laughed. "Oh, she does a little freelance stuff. Keeps busy." He took a sip of his drink. "She's not really into the whole career race. More low maintenance." The group chuckled. Clara felt the heat rise in her face, but she smiled, because she always did. Because correcting him would have felt like causing a scene. Someone added, "Must be nice, not having that kind of pressure." Evan nodded. "Exactly. We can't all be driven, right?" The words landed softly, but they cut deep. A woman nearby glanced at Clara with something like pity, then quickly looked away. The conversation shifted back to market trends and expansion plans, as if Clara had already served her purpose, as a joke, a contrast, a reminder of what not to be. Evan didn't notice Clara growing quieter, or maybe he did and didn't care. On the ride home, she stared out the window, city lights blurring into long streaks. Evan hummed along to the radio, relaxed, satisfied. "You were really quiet tonight," he said finally, not unkindly. "You okay?" Clara hesitated. "You didn't have to say it like that." Evan sighed, impatient. "Say what? I was just being honest." "Don't be so sensitive." She nodded. Again. But something had shifted, because that night, Clara understood the truth with painful clarity. Evan wasn't unaware of her value. He was deliberately lowering it, one audience at a time. And soon, he would do it in front of the wrong people. Evan didn't plan the divorce conversation the way most people do. There was no buildup, no warning, no heavy silence before the storm. He treated it like an errand. Clara was in the kitchen when he brought it up, slicing lemons for tea, the late afternoon sun slanting through the windows of their apartment. Evan leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone, his tone casual, almost bored. "I talked to a lawyer today," he said. "We should get divorced." The knife slipped, just slightly. Clara steadied it with her thumb before it could fall. She waited for more. An explanation. A reason. Something human. Evan finally looked up, surprised by her silence. "I mean, it's been obvious for a while, hasn't it?" He shrugged. "We're not compatible anymore. You want simple. I need more." More what? Clara wanted to ask. More admiration? More silence? More people who wouldn't question him? Instead, she said quietly, "When did you decide this?" Evan exhaled, as if she were asking for too much. "Don't do that. It's not about a moment. It's about reality." He gestured around the apartment. "This life, it's not going anywhere." He said this life, not us. A week later, he slid the divorce papers across the dining table like a restaurant check. No anger, no guilt, just impatience. "Standard stuff," he said. "You don't have assets. I'll keep the apartment." "Clean break." He smirked, trying to soften the blow with humor. "Honestly, Clara, you're lucky. You won't have to deal with my world anymore." Lucky. She flipped through the pages slowly. Her name appeared again and again, detached from everything that had once made it feel like hers. 7 years reduced to ink and margins. "You're not even going to fight it?" Evan asked, amused. "Most people would." Clara looked up at him then, really looked. The confidence, the certainty, the belief that she had nowhere else to go. "I don't want anything," she said. Evan laughed out loud. "See? That's what I mean. You never did." He didn't notice her hands were steady. He didn't ask why she wasn't crying. He didn't wonder what someone truly empty might still be holding back. To Evan, this was a joke with a predictable ending. What he didn't realize was that Clara wasn't losing a life. She was shedding one. And the moment she signed those papers, the balance quietly began to shift. The signing happened on a Thursday morning in a glass-walled office that smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. Clara arrived 10 minutes early. She always did. She sat alone at the end of the long table, hands folded, posture straight, eyes calm. Anyone watching would have assumed she was there for a routine appointment, not to officially end a 7-year marriage. Evan came in late. He looked relaxed, confident, almost cheerful. His jacket was slung over one shoulder, phone pressed to his ear as he finished a call. "Yeah, tonight works," he said. "I'll be free." Free. He hung up and finally looked at Clara. "You ready to get this over with?" he asked lightly, not as if they were canceling a subscription. The lawyer slid the documents forward. "If you'll just sign here and here." Clara picked up the pen. Evan watched her closely, waiting for something, for hesitation, for a crack, for emotion that would confirm his version of the story. He expected tears, or at least a question. Instead, Clara read every page slowly. Her face didn't change. She paused once, at a paragraph Evan had skipped entirely. The lawyer noticed but said nothing. Evan checked his phone again. "You don't need to read all that," he said. "It's standard." "I know," Clara replied softly. Then she signed. No shaking hand, no deep breath, just ink on paper. Evan blinked. "That's it?" he asked, disappointed. "You're really not going to say anything?" Clara capped the pen and slid it back. "What would you like me to say?" He laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "I don't know. Something. Most people would fight for their marriage, or at least for something." "I don't want anything," Clara said again. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Cross, you'll need to sign as well." Evan scribbled his name without looking, the motion careless. He pushed the folder away and leaned back, satisfied. "Well," he said, standing, "I guess that's that." He paused at the door. "You'll figure something out, Clara. You always do." He smiled, almost kindly. "Just don't expect miracles." The door closed behind him. Clara remained seated. For a moment, the room was silent except for the hum of the city outside. The lawyer studied her carefully, as if seeing her for the first time. "You're sure?" he asked quietly. Clara nodded, because the truth was simple, and Evan would never understand it. She hadn't signed because she was weak. She had signed because she was done waiting. And somewhere far beyond that office, a clock had just started counting down. Clara thought the worst part would be leaving. She was wrong. The apartment emptied faster than she expected. Evan had already packed the things he cared about: his suits, his watches, the framed awards that once crowded the walls. What remained felt like leftovers from a life no one claimed anymore. Clara packed quietly, choosing only what fit into 2 suitcases: clothes, a laptop, a few books, proof she had existed. The doorman didn't meet her eyes when she left. She stayed the first night in a modest hotel on the edge of Midtown, the kind of place people booked when plans fell apart. The room smelled faintly of detergent and old carpet, so Clara sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall, waiting for the moment she was supposed to break. It didn't come. What came instead were the small humiliations. Her joint account was frozen within 48 hours. Evan called it a banking error. The credit card declined at a grocery store. A freelance client emailed to say they were going in a different direction. A friend she'd known for years stopped replying altogether. By the end of the week, Clara understood the shape of her new life. She sublet a small studio farther downtown. No skyline view, no doorman, just a single window and the sound of traffic at night. She slept on a mattress on the floor, her suitcases stacked like temporary furniture. Evan didn't check in. Instead, she saw him online. Photos from dinners, tagged locations she used to recognize, and smiles that looked effortless. A life that appeared untouched by her absence. The silence hurt more than cruelty ever had. One evening, Clara sat on the floor, back against the wall, phone in her hand. She scrolled through old messages she hadn't had the heart to delete. Promises, jokes, versions of Evan that felt like strangers now. For the first time, doubt crept in. Maybe he was right. Maybe she really didn't have anything. Maybe letting go hadn't been strength, but surrender. She closed her eyes, breathing slowly, grounding herself the way she always had, by staying quiet, by enduring. She didn't know that this was the lowest point by design, that every closed door, every lost comfort, every unanswered call was stripping her life down to its barest truth, and that sometimes, when there's nothing left to lose, the ground beneath you isn't empty, it's solid. And Clara Ashford was standing on it for the first time. Clara didn't hear Lena Moore's name again for weeks, not directly. It surfaced in fragments, through mutual acquaintances, half-finished stories, and the careful silence that follows something people don't know how to frame yet. Evan had moved fast, too fast. Photos appeared online, new dinners, new smiles, new captions that tried too hard to look effortless. Clara told herself not to look. She looked anyway. Lena was beautiful in a way that felt deliberate. Sharp lines, confident posture, the ease of someone who believed she'd finally arrived. In every photo, Evan stood slightly in front of her, hand possessive at her waist, smile polished and proud. What Clara didn't see, but would later understand, was how tightly Lena's jaw was set, how often her eyes drifted off camera. The first crack came quietly. One afternoon, Clara received an email from an unfamiliar address. No subject line, just a single sentence. Did he ever tell you the truth about anything? Clara stared at the screen for a long time. She didn't reply. The second message came days later, longer this time. Careful. Defensive. Lena wrote about confusion, about stories that didn't line up, about realizing she was always being compared to someone she'd never met, but somehow already resented. He told me you were dependent, Lena wrote, that you wouldn't survive without him. Clara exhaled slowly. That was Evan's pattern. Simplify, diminish, rewrite. Then came the detail that shifted everything. Lena mentioned a document Evan had shown her while bragging one night. Divorce papers. He'd laughed while explaining how easily Clara had signed, how she'd walked away with nothing. She didn't even read it, he'd said. She never cared about details. Lena had believed him, until she noticed something strange. The dates didn't match the story. The language was too specific. And the lawyer's name, Thomas Reed, wasn't just any attorney. He was a fiduciary specialist. That wasn't an accident. Lena hadn't written to confess. She'd written because something felt wrong. And for the first time, Evan wasn't the smartest person in the room. Clara closed her laptop, hand steady. She didn't feel vindicated or angry. She felt clarity. Because when lies start collapsing under their own weight, they don't fall outward. They fold inward, crushing the person who built them. And Evan Cross was about to discover that the story he told everyone wasn't unraveling because of Clara. It was unraveling because the truth had finally found a witness. And witnesses, once awakened, don't stay silent. The meeting didn't feel dramatic. That was what unsettled Clara the most. Thomas Reed's office was quiet, understated, tucked inside a stone building near Wall Street that looked like it had been there longer than ambition itself. No glass walls, no branding, just thick folders, soft lighting, and the kind of silence that carried weight. Thomas was already seated when Clara arrived. He stood when he saw her, not hurried, not emotional, just respectful. "You've grown," he said gently. Clara blinked. "You knew me?" He nodded. "Since you were 17. That was the first moment her breath caught. Thomas didn't rush. He poured water, slid a single folder across the desk, and waited until she touched it. "Your mother trusted process," he said. "Not people. Especially not people." Inside the folder were documents Clara had never seen. Letters, amendments, conditions written in her mother's careful handwriting. The Ashford Continuum Trust had never been locked because Clara was irresponsible. It was locked because the inheritance was never meant to arrive easily. There was a moral clause, Thomas explained. Your mother believed wealth revealed character, but hardship refined it. He paused. You weren't required to suffer, but you were required to choose dignity without knowing the reward. Clara's throat tightened. Thomas continued. Marriage complicated things. Once you married, access paused. The trust could not be activated while your judgment was legally intertwined with someone else's. So I lost everything, Clara said quietly. No, Thomas corrected. You postponed it. He turned to the final page. The trust activates when 3 conditions are met, he said. 1. You live independently of trust resources. 2. You do not use wealth to coerce loyalty. And 3. He looked at her carefully. You walk away from a partnership that diminishes your moral agency, willingly, without leverage. Clara stared at the page. She had done all of it, without knowing, without planning, without revenge. Evan, she whispered, never knew. Thomas allowed himself a thin smile. He assumed silence meant absence. He slid one more document forward. This confirms your status as sole controlling beneficiary. Clara didn't smile, so she didn't cry. She simply closed the folder. Outside, the city moved the way it always had. Fast, loud, indifferent. But inside that room, one truth settled with quiet finality. Evan hadn't taken her future. He had unknowingly unlocked it, and the door he closed behind her would never open for him again. Clara didn't change overnight. There was no dramatic makeover, no sudden hunger for attention, no desire to prove anything to anyone. What changed was quieter and far more permanent. She started by reclaiming small choices. She moved into a temporary apartment overlooking a narrow street downtown, the kind where mornings began with the sound of delivery trucks and evenings ended with warm light spilling from bookstore windows. She bought a simple desk, a comfortable chair, and positioned her laptop near the window, not for the view, but for the reminder that she could decide where her life faced. Thomas handled the legal machinery discreetly. Clara didn't step into boardrooms or sign sweeping directives. Not yet. The trust moved when she was ready, not before. For the first time, power waited for her. What surprised her most was the absence of fear. She had expected to feel intoxicated by security, or angry at how easily everything could have been different. Instead, she felt grounded, as if the long season of uncertainty had trained her to stand without leaning. She updated her resume, not because she needed work, but because she wanted clarity. She reconnected with old contacts, not to announce who she was, but to remember who she'd been before she learned to shrink. Conversations felt different now, straighter, unapologetic. People noticed. Not the money. Cook with the presence. Clara spoke less, but when she did, people listened. She asked sharper questions. She ended conversations that drained her. She stopped explaining herself. At night, she read philosophy, psychology, notes her mother had left behind, margins filled with reminders about restraint, responsibility, and the quiet burden of choice. Clara understood them now in a way she hadn't before. This wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about returning to herself, without compromise. Evan never crossed her mind directly, not with anger, not with longing. He existed now as a closed chapter, one she no longer needed to reread to understand. What Clara was becoming didn't need his recognition. It needed her consent. And somewhere beyond the noise of Manhattan, beyond contracts and consequences, something else shifted too. Subtle, unforced. The world began responding differently, not because she demanded it, but because she no longer asked for permission to exist within it. And transformation, she learned, doesn't announce itself. It simply makes everything else fall into place. Evan Cross believed he had won. That belief settled in his chest like a warm, permanent thing. Earned, justified, undeniable. The divorce was final. Clara was gone. The silence she left behind felt less like loss and more like relief. No more quiet resistance. No more invisible judgment. No more woman reminding him of the parts of himself he preferred not to examine. His life, finally, looked the way he thought it was supposed to. Lena moved into his penthouse within weeks. She fit easily into the space Clara never seemed to fill correctly, laughing in the kitchen, hosting dinners, or tagging photos online that collected approval at record speed. Evan watched the numbers climb and mistook attention for success. At work, his confidence sharpened. He spoke louder in meetings, cut people off without apology, started dropping hints about a new chapter in his personal life. Colleagues congratulated him, some sincerely, others cautiously. Evan didn't notice the difference. When someone asked about Clara, he smiled indulgently. "We grew apart," he said. "She wanted a smaller life." The way he said it made the story feel settled. Final. True enough. He proposed to Lena at a private restaurant overlooking the river. convinced the gesture would cement everything: his status, his choices, his future. She said yes after a pause that Evan chose not to see. He posted the announcement the same night. The response was immediate. Applause, messages, validation. This was what winning looked like. And yet, beneath the celebration, small fractures began forming. Lena asked more questions than Clara ever had. About finances, about lawyers, about the details Evan brushed aside. He laughed them off, calling her cautious, calling it smart. But her eyes lingered when his answers didn't land. At night, Evan slept restlessly. He dreamed of meetings he was late to, documents he couldn't find, doors that wouldn't open no matter how hard he pushed. He woke irritated, blaming stress, ambition, the cost of being a man with momentum. He never considered that momentum could be borrowed. Because to Evan, this new life felt earned. He had traded down, then up. He had removed the obstacle. He had chosen correctly. So when the first unexpected invitation arrived, embossed and formal, Evan didn't question it. He smiled. Because winners didn't question good fortune. They assumed it belonged to them. And Evan Cross had no idea his victory lap was leading him straight toward the reckoning he thought he'd escaped. The invitation arrived on thick, cream-colored cardstock, slipped beneath Evan's penthouse door like a promise. He noticed it immediately, not because of the name printed on the envelope, but because of what it signaled: the weight, the texture, the subtle embossing that spoke to rooms he'd spent years trying to enter. This wasn't another industry mixer or a charity dinner begging for donations. This was access. "Looks important," Lena said, picking it up before he could. She turned it over, eyebrows lifting. The Ashford Continuum Annual Gala. Evan paused. The name stirred something distant and irritating, and like a word he almost remembered but didn't care enough to chase. "Never heard of it," he said, shrugging. "Probably some legacy fund trying to stay relevant." Still, he took the card back and read the details carefully. The venue made his breath hitch. The Plaza Hotel, 5th Avenue, black tie. Invite only. He smiled. By the end of the day, Evan had convinced himself the invitation was proof of his ascent. Someone important had noticed him. Someone powerful had decided he belonged in the room. He forwarded the details to his assistant and told her to clear his schedule. "This one matters," he said. In the days leading up to the gala, Evan felt a familiar rush, the anticipation he lived for. He ordered a new tux, updated his watch, rehearsed introductions in his head. He imagined the conversations, the handshakes, or the moment someone would say his name with interest instead of courtesy. Lena prepared too, though more quietly. She asked questions Evan brushed aside. "Do you know who runs the fund?" she asked once. "Does it matter?" he replied. "If they invited me, they know who I am." That was the lie he needed to believe. On the morning of the event, Evan stood before the mirror, adjusting his cufflinks, confidence settling into place. He looked successful, desired, untouchable. He had no idea the invitation wasn't a reward. It was a summons. Because the Ashford Continuum didn't gather people to celebrate them. It gathered them to observe. And somewhere within the marble halls of the plaza, a seat had been prepared, not for Evan the winner, or Evan the fiancé, or Evan the man who thought he'd outgrown his past, but for Evan Cross, the mistake. And tonight, the room would remember what he had chosen to forget. The ballroom at the Plaza Hotel glowed with quiet authority. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over marble floors, and the air carried the soft hum of money speaking to money. Evan moved through the room with practiced ease, Lena at his side, greeting faces that mattered, or might one day matter. He felt at home here. This was his element. Then the room shifted. It wasn't loud. There was no announcement at first, just a subtle change in attention, like a current pulling every gaze toward the same point. Conversations thinned, laughter softened, heads turned. Evan followed the movement instinctively. She stood near the entrance, unhurried, dressed simply but impeccably. No dramatic jewelry, no statement gown. Just quiet confidence, from the kind that didn't ask to be noticed because it expected to be understood. Clara Ashford. For a moment, Evan's mind refused to place her here. This room didn't belong to her, not anymore, not ever, if his version of the world was correct. He told himself it was coincidence, a +1, a mistake. But the way people approached her told a different story. They didn't introduce themselves. They greeted her. A man Evan recognized from finance shook her hand with deference. A woman he'd once pitched to leaned in, smiling, listening. Clara moved with ease, answering questions without explanation, her presence calm and unforced. Lena noticed first. "That's your ex-wife," she whispered, confusion tightening her voice. "Why does everyone know her?" Evan swallowed. They don't. But even as he said it, he saw Thomas Reed cross the room and stop beside Clara, speaking quietly, respectfully. Clara nodded once. Then the host stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," the man began, voice steady. "Thank you for joining us tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize the individual who makes this gathering possible." The room fell silent. "Our sole controlling beneficiary and chair of the Ashford Continuum," he continued, "Ms. Clara Ashford." The applause wasn't explosive. It was immediate. Evan felt the blood drain from his face. Clara stepped forward, composed, her eyes scanning the room, passing over Evan without pause. Not avoidance, not anger. Finality. In that instant, the truth settled with brutal clarity. She hadn't come to confront him. She had come because this was her room, and Evan Cross was no longer standing at the center of it. Evan didn't remember sitting down. One moment he was standing near the bar, the echo of applause still ringing in his ears, and the next he was gripping the edge of a chair as if the room had tilted without warning. The name Clara Ashford repeated itself in his mind, detached from the woman he thought he knew, reassembling into something unrecognizable. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. He laughed once under his breath, sharp and panicked. A mistake, a coincidence, a setup that would correct itself if he just waited long enough. But nothing corrected itself. Around him, conversations resumed. Quieter now, charged. Evan caught fragments as people passed. Sole beneficiary. Ashford Continuum. I didn't realize she was so young. Each word landed like a blow, stripping away another layer of denial. Lena sat beside him, rigid. "Evan," she said carefully, "what exactly did you sign during your divorce?" He turned to her, irritation flaring. "Standard paperwork." She walked away with nothing. Lena didn't look convinced. Then why is Thomas Reed here? The name hit harder than the applause had. Evan scanned the room and saw Reed speaking with two men he recognized from regulatory circles. People who didn't attend galas unless decisions were being shaped. Evan's mouth went dry. Memories surfaced, unwanted. The day of the signing. Clara pausing at one paragraph. The lawyer's hesitation. His own impatience. He had skimmed. He always skimmed. Details were for people with less momentum. A server passed with champagne. Evan waved it away. He pulled out his phone, fingers unsteady, and searched for the divorce agreement in his email. The document loaded slowly, each second stretching. He scrolled past the sections he remembered: property, accounts, confidentiality. Then he saw it. A clause he had never read. Mutual waiver of present and future claims arising from fiduciary interests, trusts, or beneficial control associated with the named spouse. Evan stared at the words, pulse roaring in his ears. He had signed away any claim, direct or indirect, to anything connected to Clara. Not just money, not just assets, influence, access, protection. The room seemed to close in. Lena stood. "You told me she was nothing," she said quietly. Evan looked up at the stage, where Clara now spoke with calm authority, the room listening the way it never had to him. In that moment, the truth landed with devastating precision. He hadn't lost Clara because she was weak. He had lost everything because he was careless, and the contract he mocked had already decided his future, without his consent. The boy didn't know he was telling the truth. That was what made it impossible to ignore. He stood near Clara's side during the reception, small fingers wrapped around a glass of apple juice, eyes wandering the ballroom with the honest curiosity of someone who had never learned how to pretend. Clara kept one hand lightly on his shoulder, not to restrain him, but to reassure him. He was safe. He was seen. Evan noticed him late. At first, he thought the child belonged to someone else, another donor, another guest. But then the boy laughed, a soft, familiar sound that struck something deep in Evan's chest. He stepped closer before he could stop himself. "That's your son?" Evan asked, forcing casual into his voice. Clara didn't answer right away. She didn't owe him one. The boy looked up instead. "You're Evan," he said plainly. The name landed without accusation, without fear. Evan stiffened. "Do I know you?" The boy frowned, confused by the question. "You used to live with my mom," he said, "before she stopped being sad all the time." The air around them thinned. Clara's hand tightened slightly on the boy's shoulder, not to silence him, but to ground him. She met Evan's eyes for the first time that night. Calm, unflinching. Evan swallowed. "I never made her sad." The boy considered this carefully, the way children do when sorting truth from noise. "You did," he said simply. "But you didn't see it. Oh, she cried in the kitchen when you were on calls. She told me not to worry." Evan opened his mouth. No words came. "I don't worry now," the boy added, smiling at Clara. "She laughs more." There was no malice in it, no intent to wound, just observation. Lena stood a few steps away, watching the exchange with dawning clarity. Not triumph, not jealousy, understanding. Clara knelt then, bringing herself to the boy's level. "Hey," she said gently, "thank you for being honest." He nodded, satisfied, and wandered off toward the dessert table. The moment stretched. Evan felt something inside him give way, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. He had spent years rewriting stories, reshaping memories, convincing himself that harm only counted if it was visible. But the child had seen it, and children don't lie to protect pride. Clara stood. "This," she said quietly, "is why I left." She didn't wait for his response, because the truth had already spoken, and it had chosen the one voice Evan could never argue with. Lena Moore left the ballroom without saying goodbye. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voice, no final scene. She simply stepped back, handed her champagne flute to a passing server, and walked toward the exit with a calm Evan had never seen before. He noticed too late. By the time he turned, she was already halfway across the marble floor, heels steady, shoulders straight, no hesitation in her stride. Evan followed, panic sharpening his steps. "Lena!" he called, forcing a laugh that sounded wrong even to him. "What are you doing?" She stopped near the tall doors and turned slowly. "I'm done listening to stories that only work if no one asks questions," she said. Evan scoffed. "You're overreacting. This night, it's just politics. Optics." Lena studied him for a long moment. really studied him, as if stripping away the version of Evan she had been sold and comparing it to the man standing in front of her now. "You told me she was nothing," she said quietly. "You said she needed you, that she signed away her life because she didn't understand it." He opened his mouth, ready with a dozen explanations. She didn't give him the chance. "You weren't lying to impress me," Lena continued. "You were lying to protect yourself." The words landed cleanly, precisely, without cruelty. "I saw how you looked when they said her name," she added. "That wasn't surprise. That was fear." Evan felt the room slipping from him again. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I do," Lena said, "because I recognized it. It's the same look you give when someone gets too close to the truth." She glanced back toward the ballroom, where Clara stood surrounded by quiet respect, unbothered, unperforming. "She didn't take anything from you," Lena said. "You handed it over because you thought it didn't matter." Silence stretched between them. Lena reached up and removed the ring Evan had placed on her finger weeks earlier. She set it gently on the small table by the door. "I won't be your proof of success," she said, "and I won't be your shield." Then she turned and walked out. Evan stood frozen, the weight of the ring heavier than it should have been. For the first time, there was no one left to blame. No woman to rewrite. No narrative to control. Because when even the person who benefited from the lie walks away, what remains is the truth. And Evan Cross was finally alone with it. Evan's fall didn't come with headlines. It came with silence. The Monday after the gala, his calendar looked full, but his phone stayed quiet. No congratulatory messages, no follow-up meetings. The invitation that had once felt like a crown now read like a warning he'd ignored too late. At the office, things felt different. Conversation stopped when he approached. A meeting he'd led for years was reassigned without explanation. His assistant avoided eye contact, forwarding calls instead of patching them through. When Evan asked about a delayed contract, his manager offered a tight smile. "The board wants to reassess," he said. "Risk management." Risk, the word echoed. By Wednesday, reassessment became distance. Distance became exclusion. Evan learned through a third party that a key partnership had quietly dissolved. No accusation, no drama, just a polite withdrawal. The kind reserved for people no longer worth defending. He tried to laugh it off, told himself it was temporary. That momentum always slowed before accelerating again. But momentum doesn't return when trust is gone. That evening, Evan sat alone in the penthouse that suddenly felt too large. Lena's things were gone. The ring still sat where she'd left it, untouched, accusing in its stillness. He poured a drink and stared out at the skyline he once believed reflected his importance. It didn't. Emails arrived, carefully worded, professionally distant. Invitations rescinded. Committees restructured. His name slipped lower on lists that once opened doors without effort. He finally called Thomas Reed. The call went to voicemail. Evan drove instead, desperation tightening his chest. Reed's assistant met him in the lobby and didn't invite him upstairs. "Mr. Reed has no business with you," she said calmly. "He never did." The truth settled with a weight Evan couldn't outrun. He hadn't been pushed out. He had been deemed irrelevant. By the end of the month, his role was eliminated as part of a strategic realignment. The severance was generous, but useless. Money without access. Time without influence. A name people remembered only in the past tense. Evan sat in the quiet that followed, replaying every moment he'd dismissed. Every pause, every signature, every warning he'd mistaken for weakness. This was the part no one applauded, the slow understanding that nothing had been taken from him unfairly. He had traded it all away. And the world, having finished with him, moved on without a glance back. Clara didn't celebrate Evan's fall. By the time his name began to disappear from conversations, she had already moved on. Not forward, not upward, but inward. That was where the real change had taken root. Her days settled into a rhythm that felt earned. Mornings began with quiet walks through Central Park, the city waking around her without urgency. She worked when she wanted to, not because she needed to. Decisions arrived without pressure, choices without fear. For the first time in her adult life, nothing in her world depended on someone else's approval. The trust did what it was designed to do, silently. Investments shifted, boards adjusted. Influence moved without her having to raise her voice. Clara attended meetings when it mattered and declined when it didn't. Power, she learned, was most effective when it didn't need to announce itself. What surprised her most wasn't the ease. It was the space. Space to think. Space to rest. Space to feel without bracing for consequences. People approached her differently now, not because of what she owned, but because of how she listened. Clara asked questions no one else bothered with. She remembered names. She noticed who was overlooked, and quietly, deliberately, she brought those people forward. One evening, after a long charity board session, Clara found herself lingering on the steps outside the building. The city lights reflected off wet pavement, soft and blurred. Thomas Reed stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets. "You did this the hard way," he said. Clara smiled faintly. It was the only way that felt honest. Someone approached then, not a stranger, not a savior, just a man who had worked with her on a project months earlier, thoughtful, steady. He spoke to her without assumption, without performance. When he asked if she'd like to have dinner sometime, there was no urgency in his voice, only interest. Clara said yes, not because she needed companionship, not because she wanted to prove she was chosen again, but because she wanted to choose. That was the reward no one could take from her. Not the wealth, not the access, not even the quiet satisfaction of justice. The reward was agency. And as Clara walked home that night, the city opening around her like a promise instead of a test, she understood something with gentle certainty. She hadn't endured all of it to win. She had endured it to become free. And freedom, once claimed, never asks for permission again. A year later, Evan Cross passed through Manhattan like a ghost no one noticed. He still lived in the city, though not in the skyline anymore. His name no longer opened doors. It surfaced occasionally, never with anger, never with scandal, just as a quiet example of someone who had been present once and then wasn't. No one spoke about Clara in relation to him. That was the part that hurt the most. For Clara, life didn't unfold like a victory montage. There were no headlines, no public declarations, no moment where she stood above the wreckage and smiled. Her happiness arrived the way real things do, gradually, gently, and without spectacle. She married in the fall. Not a society wedding, not a performance. Just a small ceremony near the water, surrounded by people who had known her before the world decided she mattered. The man beside her didn't promise to save her or elevate her. He promised to walk with her, steady, present, unafraid of her strength. That was enough. The boy held her hand during the vows, grinning as if he'd always known how the story would end. When Clara laughed, it wasn't restrained or cautious anymore. It was full, unfiltered, real. She kept her last name, not as a statement, as a truth. The Ashford Continuum continued its work quietly, funding education, restoring systems, supporting people who would never know her face. Clara never needed them to. Legacy, she learned, wasn't about being seen. It was about being consistent. On a cold winter morning, Clara stood by her apartment window, coffee warming her hands, watching the city stretch awake. Her life felt balanced now. Not perfect, not protected from pain, but chosen. And somewhere across town, Evan scrolled through old photos he never deleted, not out of longing, out of confusion. He still couldn't understand how the woman he dismissed had become unreachable, untouchable, whole. The truth was simple. He had mistaken silence for emptiness, patience for weakness, love for dependency. And by the time he realized the difference, the story no longer belonged to him. Clara closed the window and turned back into her life. She had nothing to prove, no one to convince, no past to outrun, only a future she had earned, piece by piece, choice by choice. And that was the ending he could never touch. And so the story comes to a close. Now let me ask you something, my friends. Are you still here with me? If you've stayed until this moment, then something in this story touched your heart in a quiet, personal way. Maybe it wasn't the wealth or the revenge or even the ending. Maybe it was the silence, the patience, the way Clara chose dignity when no one was watching. There's a lesson here that reaches far beyond drama. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Clara didn't win because she fought louder. She won because she refused to let bitterness decide who she became. She focused on what she could control, her character, her choices, her integrity. Life doesn't always reward us immediately. Sometimes it tests us by stripping things away, asking whether we can still stand when no one applauds. And as Epictetus reminded us, first say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. Healing begins the moment we stop proving our worth to people who never planned to see it. If this story resonated with you, if it mirrored a chapter of your own life, I invite you, gently, to like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel. These stories are for you. And if you're still here, maybe it's because you're stronger than you think, and your own ending is still being written. Before we end, we want to gently clarify something for our viewers. This story is a work of fiction, created for emotional storytelling and reflection. While the characters, events, and situations may feel realistic or familiar, they are not intended to represent real individuals or specific real-life cases. Any resemblance to actual people or events is purely coincidental. The purpose of this narrative is not to present financial, legal, or personal advice, but to explore human emotions, resilience, self-worth, consequences of choices, and healing after difficult relationships. Stories like this are meant to inspire thought, empathy, and personal growth, not to suggest that life always unfolds in the same way. We encourage viewers to take the message that resonates with them on an emotional level, while understanding that real life is complex and unique for everyone. Thank you for watching with an open heart and thoughtful mind.